mankind. I personally think that we should redirect our attention to this very critical the issue in Korea, so that we can pressure somehow to our legislature to act on this approval and expedite the process. At the same time, if we can do anything in the Washington, we should all do that too. So, in that regard, I think this lecture this morning is very, very timely and important. I'm sure this, actually, yesterday, Professor Eichengreen participated in a conference, another conference. Actually, I participated there also in the morning. And in the afternoon session, I wasn't there, but I just gathered that the people had spent much time on discussing the current issue of U.S., not only U.S. global subprime, the issue and the U.S. the economic the situation, and if the Professor Eichengreen has time, I'm sure he will share his views on this particular issue, current situation in both global financial market and the U.S. economy in general. Well, since Professor Eichengreen has been with us a number of times before, I don't think he needs a long introduction. But as I always, when I introduce him, say that he is one of the most highly respected scholar and teacher in economics. And he has written so many books in various areas, particularly capital flows and capital markets, multilateral institutions, including IMF, the future of IMF, how to reform IMF. There was so much thing about Euro, European Union, and Stability Pact, whole sort of institutional matters, and the exchange rate issues and so forth. And it is really, I don't see any other economist or sophist so prolific in what they write so many books, good books, and keep churning out with articles and books. And really privileged to have been a super friend of mine and to have this opportunity. Okay, with this, I will just invite Professor Eichengreen. Please join me in welcoming.
Good morning. Let me start by thanking my friend Eichengreen for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you again. I'm always struck that it's only in Seoul where one can generate an audience equivalent to this one at 7 in the morning. The speaker may have a little bit to do with that. The rather remarkable setting of the room has a little bit to do with that. I suspect that our host and convener has a little bit to do with that as well. It's hard to know where to start and it's hard to know where to conclude. A lot of things are going on in the world. I had agreed to give my perspective on the Korean economy and talk a little bit about implications of the FTA, and I will try to do both of those things to an extent. But there are also potentially very important developments in the world economy, what we have been calling the subprime crisis in the United States, and what we may soon be calling the incipient recession in the U.S. So I'll try to touch on all of those issues, and I apologize to our translator if the more I think about this, the more I am inclined to depart from my prepared remarks, but I hope I will not depart too much. So let me start with my perspective on Korea and bridge from there to talking a little bit about the importance and prospects for the free trade agreement with the United States. The historical background is known to all of you, of course, but it's always important for a visitor to remind himself of it when he comes here. Korean economic growth is one of the great success stories of the last half century. A growth rate averaging 8% per year over fully half a century fundamentally transformed the country and the lives of its citizens. Korea was one of the very poorest countries in the world circa 1960. It now is, depending on how you count, the world's 12th largest economy. It's a member of the OECD. It's known around the world as a producer of motor vehicles, household appliances, consumer electronics, and of course, youth culture. It's hard to imagine a more dramatic success story. I am struck, though, that almost from the start, Korean observers downplayed the economic miracle, and they raised questions, which is probably not an unhealthy thing, about the sustainability of that miracle. In the 1970s, it was commonplace to question the efficiency of much of the investment in the heavy and chemical industries, and to complain about low profits and mediocre productivity growth. The 1980s started with a debt crisis, a recession, a wrenching structural adjustment, and they concluded with a wage explosion, all of which were seen as potential threats to economic growth. The first half of the 1990s was dominated by gradual economic and financial liberalization, and the government campaigned to rein in the big conglomerates, motivated by the belief that a protected economy and tribal dominance were, again, incompatible with sustained economic growth in the 21st century. The second half of the 1990s was, of course, the period of the financial crisis. Now there is a secular decline in growth rates from the high to the single middle digits against the backdrop of competition from China, which again raises questions both in the minds of the public and of officials about Korea's current economic performance and future prospects. My point is that there's nothing new about the current sense of self-doubt. I think Koreans have always questioned whether their country's impressive economic growth is in fact built on firm foundations. The tendency to emphasize problems rather than achievements. Maybe it's a national personality trait. It's certainly not a personality trait shared by citizens of my country. But I think it may lend itself to an excessively pessimistic view of the country's economic prospects. That's what I'm going to argue for the next 10 minutes. It is true that per capita incomes and productivity in Korea remain lower than in, say, Japan and the United States, but both per capita incomes and productivity are continuing to grow more rapidly in Korea. Convergence is continuing. It could be that the current feeling of self-doubt reflects the awareness that other countries in the region, think China, are growing even faster or that Korea itself needs to grow faster in order to be ready for the difficult, costly, eventual task of reunification. But my sense, for what it's worth, is that the current unease is simply the latest manifestation of this long-standing tendency to emphasize problems at least as much as achievements. So let me give you my take on why Korea isn't growing faster. And that will then bring me for a few minutes at least to the FTA. Most discussions of that question focus on low investment and on the high yuan, of course. It is true the investment GDP ratio has fallen from the nearly 40% levels scaled in the mid-1990s to barely 30% today. And we know from standard economic models that less investment means slower economic growth. Indeed, the modern models that economists use to understand economic growth attach even more importance to investment as embodying new technology, throwing off positive spillovers or externalities. So the idea that the decline in investment could be having quite large negative effects on growth in Korea, that idea is supported by the observation that it's mainly investment in machinery and transport equipment as opposed to where the productivity is located. It's mainly those forms of investment that have declined most rapidly in the country. So we must ask why the lower levels of investment, and here there is no shortage of explanations. There's competition in assembly operations and in manufacturing generally from low-cost China. That has encouraged Korean firms to invest abroad rather than at home, giving rise to the notorious hollowing out of Korean industry. And it's true that China has become a principal destination for Korean investment. Fully 60% of Korea's FDI is now destined for other Asian countries, and that really means China. And I am struck by the fact that it's not only the large companies, the conglomerates, but medium-sized and smaller Korean enterprises that are investing abroad. For what it's worth, my own research, however, does not support the idea that that the problem is that investment has been diverted from the domestic economy to China. Surely there is an incentive for Korean firms to invest in processing and assembly facilities in China. But there's also an incentive for Korean firms and foreign companies also to invest here in facilities for the production of the machinery, the equipment, and the technology that this country exports to China to meet China's insatiable appetite for investment. There's also incentive to invest in factories for producing here the relatively sophisticated parts and components that China doesn't yet know how to produce, that then undergo final assembly there. So while Korea itself should undertake more foreign investment in China, Korea should also receive more foreign investment because its economic structure, which is heavy in the production of capital goods, and its level of technological sophistication, which is rising, which is relatively high and rising, are complementary to China's. So the conclusion I draw is that China is not to be blamed for the fall in Korean investment rates. Maybe the problem, maybe the explanation is that the riskiness of investment in Korea has risen. Before the financial crisis of 1997-98, firms engaging in high levels of investment believed that they were on the receiving end of guarantees from the government, that they could take the risks entailed in high levels of investment, and if things went wrong, the government would bail them out, it would backstop them. That actually, I'm not entirely convinced by that argument. As all of you will know, there were chaebol bankruptcies before the crisis. The ninth largest chaebol went bankrupt in the 1960s. An important chaebol built around the production of plywood went bankrupt in 1980, and then there were Hanbo and Kia in the 1990s. It could be argued that the macroeconomic environment is more uncertain now because the Korean economy has been deregulated, the exchange rate is floating, and the financial system has been open to the world. And it is true that uncertainty is a key variable in modern theories of investment. The greater is uncertainty, the stronger the incentive to hold off before investing and to wait and see how conditions affecting profitability will develop. One observation consistent with that emphasis on uncertainty is that the dispersion of growth projections by forecasters trying to project Korean economic growth, the dispersion of those forecasts has increased significantly in the last 10 years. But again, I'm not entirely convinced. If you look back at earlier Korean history, I think you see there was always a high level of uncertainty. The economy was always volatile. That's true whether you're talking about 1979, followed by debt crisis and recession, or 1987, big political changes, or 1993. Anyone, I think, who was engaging in high levels of investment in the belief that returns were certain must have been deluding himself. The alternative is that the lower levels of investment that we're now seeing in Korea are basically a healthy phenomenon. That's going to be my argument. As the economy matures and the high growth period ends, a lower level of investment becomes necessary to sustain any rate of profitability. Failing to recognize that levels of that as growth slows, there is downward pressure on profitability. I think that failure can explain why investment rates remained high through the first half of the 1990s and why the financial crisis then followed. One has to explain, of course, why managers were so slow to acknowledge this downward pressure on profitability. And here the obvious explanation is weaknesses in the Korean system of corporate governance, which gave outside investors limited ability to monitor and discipline managers who were interested in empire building or had their own private agendas. But the financial crisis then changed things. It opened the eyes of managers to the fact that the high growth era was finally over. It led to improvements in shareholder rights and corporate governance that prevented bondholders and managers from engaging in empire building. The fact that the rate of return on investment is now quite respectable. It's higher than it was even in the first half of the 1990s, I think is consistent with this interpretation that the lower level of investment is necessary, and it's basically a healthy thing. The other popular explanation for why Korea isn't growing faster is, of course, the high won. And I think that explanation is related, since one factor that could be limiting profitability and the rate of return on additional investment is, of course, a strong exchange rate. Everyone in this audience will be aware of the level of the exchange rate and of complaints about the extent of its appreciation in the last couple of years, and about the fact that the won has appreciated in particular against the Chinese renminbi and the Japanese yen as well. To my mind, this way of thinking about the problem, that you have to think about what's going on in China and Japan as well as what's going on in Korea, going on in Korea is the right way of thinking about the exchange rate problem. The yen has been weak because the Japanese economy has been weak. I think it remains relatively weak despite the events of the last fortnight, because Japanese economic growth is still relatively anemic. So you will gather that I'm not among those who is convinced that Japan is now embarked on a vigorous recovery. The yen is weak because Japan has had a decade-long slump and the government lacks other instruments with which to stimulate the economy. The dollar, for its part, is weak because the United States has a big current account problem, and I think with the subprime crisis, it's likely that the dollar is going to get considerably weaker going forward. And with the yen and the dollar weak, it's almost a matter of definition that other currencies, like the won, have to be strong through no fault of the Bank of Korea. So with Japanese growth slow and U.S. growth slowing and the Chinese following the dollar, it's not surprising, I think, that Korean growth and investment are not as high as might be hoped. So I regard the strong won as more a symptom than an independent cause of the pressures on the Korean economy. I doubt, therefore, that much can be done about the problem. You don't treat symptoms, you hope that someone will treat the underlying cause of the illness. I think lowering interest rates at this point would bump up against the Bank of Korea's inflation target, so I'm not a critic of the steps that the Bank of Korea took, what was it, last week now, to raise the rate. Sterilized intervention, I think, wouldn't work given the openness of Korea's capital markets and close substitutability between domestic and foreign assets. Korea could prevent the exchange rate from rising or from being so strong by tightening fiscal policy, but that's not a good thing to do in a situation of relatively slow growth. So grin and bear it is not very helpful advice in terms of the exchange rate, but I think there are few alternatives for Korea, given that the high level of the exchange rate mainly reflects problems abroad. So let me return to my theme, which is why Korea is growing more slowly than in the past, and what can be done about it. As I've argued, part of the answer is simply greater maturity, less scope for growth through catching up. But another part is the difficulties of restructuring the economic and social system. I think of an economic and social system like the one of this country as a set of interlocking parts. The parts fit together, they work together like the different gears, like the mechanism of a clock or a wristwatch. The operation of each individual component interacts with and complements the operation of the others. Now assume that the mechanism has to be updated for the circumstances of the 21st century because you're approaching the technological frontier and you want to become a knowledge economy. The problem is you can't replace all the parts at the same time. There is no cosmic watchmaker who can immediately update all of the parts. And the danger is if you begin to change some of them in advance of the others, there's the risk of incompatibility, or at least slippage between the old gears and the new ones. Another analogy would be when jet engines replaced propellers on airplanes. New engines promise to enhance efficiency and increase speed, but to make that possible, you also have to develop new stabilizers, new wing designs, new fuel delivery systems, and so forth. Simply installing new engines without also making the other changes threaten to reduce efficiency and stability rather than enhancing them. So the equivalent for an economy is capital markets, labor markets, and product markets, along with policies for their regulation. My story about Korea is that Korea's bank-based financial system was very good for mobilizing large amounts of savings and plowing them into established industries that used familiar technologies. A labor market in which workers in the large firm sector enjoyed relatively high levels of employment security, but little autonomy on the job. That worked well when growth depended on providing workers vocational training and familiarizing them with new technologies. An industrial structure dominated by large firms was well suited to a period when technological change meant importing technology from abroad, especially technologies offering economies of scale. Government policies emphasizing saving and extending guarantees for investment were appropriate when the task for growth was to expand capacity in industries using known technologies rather than to develop new products and processes at home. So the point is that these different elements of the Korean system fit together in complementary ways. For example, by providing steady finance to an established set of industrial clients, the banking system allowed those companies to provide vocational training and offer stable employment to their workers because they had a stable source of external finance, irregardless of fluctuations in cash flow and the like. Strict regulation of the labor market made lending decisions easier for banks and so forth. The different elements complement one another. So now that model needs to be updated for the 21st century. Korea is approaching the technological frontier, and the importance of innovation, capacity to innovate, is correspondingly more important. The country's bank-based financial system needs to give way to stock markets and to venture capital to an increasing extent because markets are better than banks at taking bets on unproven competing technologies. Technological uncertainty implies the need to encourage more SMEs because the small and medium-sized firms tend to be the sources of radical new technologies, not exclusively, but I think disproportionately so. All this implies the need for more turnover in the labor market as more firms are born and more firms die. The role for government no longer is to encourage investment generally or to encourage particular investment decisions, but simply to subsidize R&D and tertiary education, things that throw off positive externalities for a knowledge economy. So the point is that reforms are complementary, but there isn't any all-powerful social planner or government agency with the capacity to implement those various reforms simultaneously. The different components making up the mechanism evolve at different rates. They necessarily get reformed at different speeds. So here I think the financial reform has gone faster than the industrial restructuring, and the reorientation of government policy has gone slowest of all. So I think the problem of slow growth in Korea at the beginning, slow growth by your standards, at the beginning of the 21st century, is a corollary of this difficult process of structural adjustment that is disruptive. Change is disruptive, and especially change of a system of interlocking components, which is the definition of an economic and social system, is especially disruptive to growth. It doesn't make the destination any less desirable or the change any less necessary, but it does have a depressing effect in the short and intermediate run on growth. So this is where I do think that policymakers' emphasis on the FTA has provided, has played a useful role. I really see the FTA as a mechanism for intensifying product market competition. in Korea. Partly it's a signaling mechanism on the part of the government that it's signaling that it's really serious about promoting freer product market competition in Korea. And partly it's not a signal. Once it gets implemented, it's going to be a market fact. There's going to be much more import competition from the United States in pharmaceuticals, auto parts, and a variety of other industries that are going to force Korean companies to shape up or die. So the argument about product market competition is that it has really been shown mainly by the OECD in a variety of contexts as a key element in this restructuring process that I described before. If you look at countries that started with economic and social systems appropriate for catch-up growth, just like Korea has undergone for the last half-century, Europe had to catch up to the United States, starting with only half of its per capita GDP in 1950. Especially in the third quarter of the 20th century, their economic and social systems then had to undergo rather radical change. And some European countries have succeeded in remaking their economies. Ireland, the United Kingdom, to an extent, the Scandinavian countries, to a surprising extent that is not appreciated outside Northern Europe. And even Germany, I think, has finally made considerable strides in remaking its economy for the needs of the 21st century, more high-tech, more export orientation, more flexibility. What has been the key to their success? To a large extent, intense product market competition has sharpened the incentive for firms to make hard changes, even hard changes that are painful and risky in the short run. So that's what the OECD has shown quite strongly for Europe, that where product market competition has been the most intense, the structural change has been the most extensive and successful. So that's really why I think Korean policymakers have made the right choice and made an important choice in emphasizing the FTA. It's going to result in more intense product market competition and catalyze, I think, a variety of other changes. It will do so, of course, only if it's ratified by both partners. So I would like to be the messenger providing a more positive message about public opinion and political reaction to the FTA on Capitol Hill and in Washington, D.C. The current situation is not very positive. People in Korea know what a presidential election, how it can affect the policy debate. It causes candidates to posture, to take populist positions in order to try to secure the nomination and win the election, and that's very much what we're seeing in the United States. I think all the Democratic candidates have come out stating their opposition to ratification of the FTA. So Hillary Clinton has come out opposing it, Obama has come out opposing it, and Edwards has come out opposing it. On the Republican side, there hasn't been much discussion of the Korea-U.S. FTA, but I think a Republican president, whoever that person might be, will have to contend with a heavily Democratic Congress, given the way the political winds tend to shift back and forth, both after many years of a Republican-dominated Congress. The electorate may feel it's time for a shift, and as well because of what's happening in Iraq, which is not good for the Republicans. There may be a further shift coming. So all of that, I think, will make ratification by the United States, unfortunately, quite difficult. It will require presidential leadership to get the Congress to agree. It will require the political candidates who oppose the FTA to turn into political leaders, or if they'll require the candidates to turn into statesmen or stateswomen, and to decide that there are larger issues at stake once the election is concluded. But I think my message would be the need for continuing structural change in Korea is there. It's important, and to rely on the FTA as the catalyst for that is going to be risky, because to rely on U.S. ratification will be risky, unfortunately, as well. So that doesn't make me entirely pessimistic about Korea. I think there are important changes going on in not only in financial markets, but in terms of industrial restructuring and in terms of labor market reform. If you believe my story about transitional difficulties, the transition doesn't go on forever, and once it is largely complete, there is reason to hope that Korean growth rates will then accelerate again. So the good news is that my story points to a somewhat happier future. There is a big however, and that brings me in my final few minutes to what has been going on in global financial markets. The big however is the crisis in the United States. My view is that investors in Asia have been too slow to recognize the gravity of the subprime crisis and its implications for Asian markets. So I was telling my seatmates at the front table that the first thing I did when I woke up this morning and I turned on the television in my hotel room was 3 professors debating the likelihood of recession in the United States, and none of them were particularly optimistic either. My own view at the moment is quite pessimistic about the United States. I think it's very difficult to tell a story that does not involve a recession within the next 12 months. The U.S. housing bubble has burst. That's not news to you and me, of course. We know that existing whole home sales had already dropped by 20% from their peak even before any of the subprime news occurred. New home sales had dropped by 40% even before the recent bout of turmoil. So we know new home sales are going to drop now a heck of a lot more than 40% from their peak. And really this has already happened. If you look around, I look around Northern California, so new home sales have stopped. Residential construction has stopped. Residential construction accounts for 40% of fixed investment in the United States. So if nothing else has happened, fixed investment has fallen by half. So that's a big change on the investment front. So the real question is, what's going to happen on the consumption front? And that's where I think the subprime crisis makes a difference. All of a sudden, the consumer, the American consumer who has been blithely going down to their favorite electronics store and buying the latest Chinese assembled consumer electronics, finally realizes that there is a problem, that they can't use their homes as a piggy bank anymore by enjoying the capital gains and refinancing their mortgages. Finally, late last week, we saw this in the consumer confidence numbers. So the University of Michigan does a monthly survey, and they were expecting that the index would be 88 on a 100 scale. Last week it was 83. So the consumer has begun to wake up and smell the coffee, if you will, and consumption is 70% of the U.S. economy. So if the American household, who has been the world's consumer of last resort now, goes on strike, I think that will have serious implications not only for the U.S. but for Asia and the world. So everybody has been debating the likelihood of decoupling, that Asia can continue on its merry way because Asia trades with itself increasingly and not simply with the United States. So you can tell I'm a skeptic about decoupling. A lot of that intra-Asian trade is in parts and in components. It leads to assembly operations of final products that are then sold to the United States. So I think this implies a significant slowdown in Chinese economic growth, which may not be a bad thing for China given its overheating problems, but won't make life any easier for Korean companies that sell capital equipment, components, etc. to China for assembly and sale to the United States. I worry about Asia's other supposed growth pole, Japan. Mrs. Watanabe has rediscovered risk. She has discovered that the exchange rate can move, so she's keeping her money at home now rather than engaging in carry trades. Among other things, that is meaning a stronger yen, which may mean less competitive Japanese exports, the return of deflation. I worry about the implications of all this for the Japanese economy as well. So my view is that Asia has to prepare now for a slowdown in growth. With growth in China slowing in particular, none of the neighbors are going to be immune. So I cannot resist observing that I'm not just jumping onto the latest bandwagon full of pessimists, that my Seoul National University colleague Young-Chul Park and I wrote an article actually a year and a half ago in which we argued that the main threat to economic growth in Asia came from the United States, and we suggested that a significant fall in asset values in the U.S., and including housing prices like we're seeing now, could lead to an American recession, and that an American recession would lead to an economic slowdown in Asia. So honesty requires me to admit that we anticipated that those problems, a slowdown, a recession in the United States spilling over to Asia, would be accompanied by a sharp drop in the dollar. And so far, it's interesting and a little bit perplexing that all these problems in the market for CDOs and even commercial paper in the United States, all through the credit markets in the U.S., with only the Treasury bond market immune so far, this has not led to a drop in the dollar. Why has the market in CDOs been infected? Why has the market in commercial paper been infected? Why is everybody so worried about bad financial regulation and crony capitalism in the United States? I love to draw this parallel with the Asian crisis literature, and yet investors have not fled the United States for other countries, and the dollar has not collapsed. Well, I don't know exactly, but I think it's too early to dismiss the possibility that another casualty of this recent turmoil could be the value of the dollar. Foreign investors, including foreign central banks, have been diversifying out of U.S. Treasury bonds into mortgage-backed securities and the U.S. stock market. And those investments are going to look considerably less attractive now in light of recent events. So the headline in the Financial Times this morning, I have read the headline, but I haven't read the entire story, is that the Bank of China announced that it had a large position. It had, in fact, on its balance sheet a large position in U.S. mortgage-backed securities. Asian investors have been diversifying out of low-yielding U.S. Treasury bonds into other U.S. financial assets. So these are supposedly the AAA securities, but nobody exactly knows what the rating agencies attached AAA to, and whether some of the same problems are lurking there. This
lack of financial transparency that apparently characterizes U.S. financial markets may make the United States look like a less attractive place to park your international reserves. And if central banks and other investors decide to diversify out of Treasury bonds, that will now mean diversifying out of the United States and diversifying out of dollars in particular. So I think the result could be a sharply lower dollar, which would be more bad news for Asian exporters. So which countries do I think are at risk? When Professor Park and I did this analysis a year and a half ago, we said Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan, since if you look at the raw numbers, they depend most on exports to the United States. Korea, we lumped into a second category, still at risk, but not as much as the three aforementioned. We put Korea together with Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand. You can make your own guess about who's at risk, but that's still my best guess about who will be hit hardest by the coming U.S. slowdown. It will be especially bad news for Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. It will certainly not be good news for Korea. So I've covered a lot of ground, probably too much ground for so early in the morning. Let me stop there. I'm happy to take questions on any of these issues, all of this material. Thank you very much.